All right, good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to today's webinar hosted by the UChicago Center in Delhi. This session marks the inaugural edition of our new workshop series that we have titled the Chicago School of Thought, a virtual workshop series on the emerging research methodologies in the social sciences. Organized by the UChicago Center in Delhi, which is the University of Chicago's main scholarly hub in India and South Asia, this series is a part of our broader commitment to fostering global academic collaboration and dialogue. The series will feature virtual conversations between scholars from India and the United States, highlighting innovative and interdisciplinary approaches to research in the social sciences and the humanities. Designed primarily for academics, research scholars, graduate students, and postdoc fellows, these sessions will delve into diverse methodologies and offer practical insights into contemporary research practices across fields such as political science, anthropology, history, psychology, media studies, and more. We are thrilled to begin this session and our series with a conversation with an expert in the field of political science and our very own alumnus from the University of Chicago, Professor Asha Sarangi. Asha Sarangi is a professor at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and she has been teaching there since 2003. She completed her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago and has received numerous fellowships over the past decades, including the National Scholarship awarded by the Government of India to study abroad, as well as 4 distinguished fellowships at the University of Chicago during her doctoral studies, the Junior Fellowship of the American Institute of Indian Studies. Professor Sarangi has also received a junior fellowship from the Department of Culture of the Government of India and the Social Scientist Award under the Indo-French Cultural Exchange Program. She was invited to be a part of several projects in Europe, including being a global partner for the Swiss National Science Foundation, a funded project in Geneva, Switzerland, and to join as a collaborator on the Forum of Federation project on federalism and language policy, and a jury member for the Federal Scholar in Residence program in Bolzano, Italy. In recent years, she has been invited to be a non-funded academic partner of the EU RAC Research Rise 2018 to 24 and a member of the advisory board of EU RAC Project 2020 on the theme of Europe as a global actor at Middlesex University 2015. She was also invited as a visiting professor at the Center for South Asian Studies at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. Her main areas of interest are political and cultural economy of development in modern India, state and development in India, identity and politics in South Asia, and more specifically, the politics of linguistic nationalism in modern India. She has written extensively on areas of language, nationalism, state formation, and identity construction in edited volumes and various journals, including the new introduction to V.P. Menon's volume, Integration of Indian States, which was republished by the Orient Black Swan in 2014 after 6 decades. She has edited a volume titled Interrogating Reorganization of States, Culture, Identity, and Politics in India, and a volume titled Language and Politics in India. Besides this, she has published about 4 dozen articles in peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes on various themes. In addition to this, she has supervised more than 60 MPhil dissertations and PhD theses of students in the Center for Political Studies in JNU. She remains an important voice in South Asian political thought, and we are honored to have her kickstart this exciting session in conversation with the Executive Director of the UChicago Center in Delhi, Dr. Leni Chaudhuri. Without further ado, I'm so excited to begin the session. Over to you, Dr. Leni.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jabakshi. Well, it's indeed an honor and a privilege for the UChicago Center in Delhi to host this conversation with Professor Asha Sarangi. And my personal privilege, Asha, to be in conversation with you. And I know that it's hard to do justice to Asha's work in one session, but we would like her to throw up a few issues which will be further discussed during the course of this session and further. So without spending any more time, I would dive straight into the session. And Asha, it's our opportunity to ask you whatever questions that have been coming up in our minds about this discipline. So bear with me and the others who will ask you questions. So Asha, my first question stems from the topic itself. As we all know, the discipline of political science has undergone remarkable changes over the last several decades. It has widened both conceptually and both the conceptual and empirical domains of the discipline and its concerns in the broader field of social sciences. So what do you mean by the interdisciplinarity of political science? And if I may add, its forms and content.
Thank you, Leni, and thank you, Juvakshi, whom I have been writing mails. Thank you for inviting me. I think it's great honor for me as well. And being an alumnus of Chicago, University of Chicago, it's always a privilege to be part of any initiative that Delhi Center takes. So I think this is a great series that both of you have thought of starting at the center, because we are living in times when the whole idea of knowledge production, particularly in social sciences, has been receiving very different kind of feedback, both from the state as well as from the societal concern. So I think it's important, given the times that we are living in, that we reflect and we think through some of the paradigms of thinking or some of the forms in which the knowledge production has taken place in the vast area of social sciences, not just at the University of Chicago, but I would say globally. So just to start with the first question, I think, which is the heart of this conversation that we are having, what do I mean by interdisciplinarity? I think when we use the word interdisciplinarity, we also tend to think that there are certain disciplinary boundaries and borders that each discipline has carved for itself in a long journey of its growth and expansion. And what political science as a discipline grew, let's say from the 19th century or early 20th century onwards in different parts of the world, and what political science is today as it is being taught or it is being studied or it is being reflected upon, it has undergone tremendous transformation. So, one of the ways, among many others, it's not possible to do justice to the very concept of interdisciplinarity. But the idea is, how is it that the discipline of political science has either borrowed or has abandoned some of its original premises and some of its own disciplinary frameworks, which that it included, let's say, in the 1930s and 40s, very seriously it engaged with. And now when we talk about political science as a discipline, we tend to think about about it in a lot more innovative way. So the concern is to actually move from the narrow boundaries of the discipline. And oftentimes people will ask you, when you use the word political science, people say, is it a science? And what do you do in this discipline? Because unlike other disciplines of social sciences, whether history or anthropology or sociology or economics, doesn't have the added term science. And for long, political science was conceived as having the potential of certain kind of a predictability or certain kind of a verifiability of facts and analysis that will prove to be right or wrong. So I think from that time onwards to what it is now, the discipline has evolved in tandem with many other disciplines. And as a result, you can say there is an interdisciplinarity of a certain sort. New areas of scholarships have emerged, new areas of research have evolved, but also certain breaking down of very narrow borders and boundaries around the discipline has also taken place, which I think is in sync with the time that we're living in. No discipline can ever be seen in a very closeted term. So that is what I meant by interdisciplinarity, that it has broken away from very, very rigid disciplinary boundaries. Now, to come to the second part about methodological pluralism, which is in the title, as a result of this kind of loosening of the disciplinary boundaries and walking into, let's say, the other areas of other disciplines, it is quite evident that it has adopted a variety of methodological frameworks. And no longer we look at the discipline only doing formal modeling, only doing statistical analysis, only doing quantitative stuff, only doing, certain kind of a very given methodological framework, which dominated it, let's say, for the first few decades in the 20th century. But what has happened is that number of methodological issues have emerged, number of methodological frameworks have been adopted. As a result, we have moved away from some kind of a what one can call methodological monism, methodological holism, or in some ways methodological individualism. So it is in that sense so what has happened in the process is that many more contestations have also happened. The discipline itself has been interrogated very, very seriously by the scholars who work within and from inside the discipline. So people use terms like mixed methods, multiple methods, and all of this, in my view, is still very narrow when we use the word methodological pluralism, because we are inviting a kind of question that no methodology is adequate or sufficient enough to address all the complex issues in any discipline of social science. So some may call it that we are living in times of hybridization, but it has more to do with it than this. For example, just to give you some example to make it clear, the issue of ethical neutrality, the issue of facts and values, the issue that is about the tenability, durability, research, that the research outcome of a researcher has, these are all still very central questions for any discipline, and more so for political science. So so the question that comes to mind when one is talking about this kind of a interrogation of the discipline is as to how does a researcher evaluate and interpret the facts in the field. I think that's the first question that one must ask, whether in political science or any other discipline. As a researcher, only having a certain kind of a subject position, a very valued subject position, going to the field and doing research, or should the researcher also complicate his or her own position in the field and therefore be mindful of what the field throws up? So, in other words, political science has been heavily dominated by a research method called participant observation, and so for example, if you are studying the anti-CAA protests that happened, or let's say if you are participating in any kind of a religious procession, just to give you some example, it's not sufficient only to go and observe and write and think about it. Your own positionality vis-a-vis the subject that you're studying has to be thought through, has to be complicated, has to be sort of interrogated. So I think the work that comes to my mind is a very interesting work that was published many years ago by William Sachs, a German scholar, called The Mountain Goddess. And this was about the Rajat Yatra, a long pilgrimage that happens in the mountains of Upper Himalayas. And the person spent several years observing, participating, being involved in the pilgrimage itself. So he was a pilgrim, but at the same time, he was also studying the pilgrimage. So how does then one talk about the questions of fact, value, ethics in this mode of participant observation? And I would only say that participant observation as a mode of doing research is one of the modes, is one of the methods, because it does in a way throw up the idea of heteroglossic social reality, a multiple, a plural, a very heterogeneous social reality that the researcher has to make sense of. So in other words, earlier methods in a way did not question the privileges or the subject position of the participant observer. Right? If you look at the literature that emerged in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, during the time of modernization school of thinking, and during the time of behaviorism, it was seen it's okay. There is a certain kind of a scientific lens that the researcher wears, and therefore whatever outcome he or she presents from the field are authentic, are valid, are acceptable. But I think we have come a long way, like in other disciplines, where we do question the very situatedness of the participant observer. We do take into account the what we can call a cultural translation as to what happens, what sort of happens in the field itself, not simply in terms of the use of a language or its interpretation, but also in terms of cultural conversations that happen. So, as an outsider to the field, do I really understand what is it that is going in the minds of the people who are part of my study? So it is in that sense that methodological pluralism has brought all these different facets of analysis into the field, into the discipline of political science. Uh, Another question which I think which has haunted all social scientists, but I think since we are talking about political science, let me only focus on that, which is this idea of empiricism, that empirical reality is not simply uh, sort of without any cultural or social construction of it. In fact, the way in which the reality is perceived phenomenologically and acted upon is very much culturally and socially, and you can say ideologically determined. So, how the researcher perceives it also has to do with this part of empirical reality, which has to keep in mind as to why is it that um, certain empirical realities make better sense to us or easily make sense to us, and certain don't. Right? So I think one has to also look at the way in which the tension exists between the observer and the observed in the field itself. And these are some of the questions which I think earlier escaped the minds of early political scientists, but now we do take into account very seriously these issues. For example, the category of experience. Now, experience has been problematized too, not just by anthropologists or other or sociologists, but also by political scientists. So it is not just having an experience of a certain kind, which is enough, but how experience also constitutes your subject position. You do get constituted by the experience of your own self. And I think this was earlier not seen in this kind of a phenomenological manner, in this kind of a deep ethnographical interpretative manner. So therefore, the idea of the methods is very not just problematic, but also deeply political. What kind of methods to adopt? Why do you adopt a particular kind of method? Which method would you adopt for which kind of work that you undertake? All these are not simple apolitical questions. They are deeply political. And methodological pluralism, therefore, will question the normative order of the concept formation. And that's the heart of it, that the concept formation is not simply a neutral exercise. What goes into the making and unmaking or remaking of a concept itself is a political act. And it is not based only simply on acting upon some empirical reality out there, because it has to do with the continuous contestation between and among various factors around the field of your research. Some of them may take universal categories, but they might also be very, very particular and tangent categories. So inquiry concepts become very important into the inquiry of social sciences. So I'm reminded of this beautiful book that an anthropologist, George Stocking, wrote. It was called Ethnographer's Magic. And what he talked about in that book was that there is a certain kind of ambiguity of the field worker's position. And this ambiguity of the field worker's position, what he called neutrality with engagement. So what you have here is some kind of a tension, or you can say some kind of a dualism between historicism of a certain kind about the idea of the past as to how the knowledge production has taken place or has traveled to us in terms of the archives of the discipline, but how it has lent to certain kind of presentist understanding of it, something in terms of its contemporary evaluation and re-evaluation. And there is this dialectic between the historicism and presentism that actually marks the wide range of approaches, wide range of methodological frameworks that have emerged in the discipline over the last 100 or more years. So
great. Thank you. Thank you, Asha. That was an excellent introduction to the topic. I have two questions. I'll kind of ask them both together. So what you're implying is that interdisciplinarity has strengthened the discipline in multiple ways and brought in objectivity. And to further follow up on your description of the methodological approaches, what I was wondering is that what are your thoughts about the new methodological approaches that have been interrogated, the deep structures of power, particularly while studying the institution of state and its forms of power? Have the new approaches brought a different perspective while exploring the other institutions and their power bases? Maybe if you could just elaborate a bit on those.
Right. No, I think that's an excellent question, Leni. And I think that is at the heart of the discipline or any discipline for that matter. But I think in political science, when we think about, the very idea of political has to do with the question of power. And it's not simply what Dal said, who gets what, when, and where, but how the idea of power has to be made sense of, where it resides, how sometimes there are ways in which the power does not manifest itself, but it very much exists there. So before I answer that, I think what is important is how the context or what is called contextualism as a method, as a form of analysis, has come to stay in our field or in our discipline. And what I mean by contextualism is not simply to just look at the context, whether historical past or contemporary, times, but how a context is very much intricately connected to a certain notion of a text. Now, when I say certain notion of a text, it does not necessarily mean, some book or sacred scripture, but a certain kind of understanding that has emerged from historical period onward. For example, if we talk about the idea of liberty or freedom or equality, there's certain theories that come to your mind. There's certain practices that are related to those theories that come to your mind. So the whole idea of this, past and present that earlier I was talking about on a continuum gives us an understanding of contextualism. It's very important that we do not sort of abandon this idea of context. If we do that, we actually move into some kind of a historical anarchism. But the question that comes to mind is, does a context also provide a new text, a new vocabulary, a new language, a new keywords to understand the same old phenomena? For example, what you said in terms of understanding the idea of the state and its various, institutions of power, have we really thought about the institution of the state in many different ways, and some of the ways which actually have departed from the earlier understanding of the state? So the context is very important. So the whole genre of political theory, political philosophy, political thought, which has spent great deal of time, both in the Western canon and non-Western canon, on the ideas which have universal applicability, but which are also particularly located in their own time and space, right? So Kantian idea of enlightenment, if it has to be made sense of, you have to understand the historical context within which he wrote that. You cannot understand it without the French Revolution. So I think it is important that one wears a critical lens to understand the context which gives rise to a certain kind of a textual understanding within the discipline over a long period of time. And that's where the hermeneutics come in, the idea of interpretation, the idea of making sense of it through meaning structures, which actually simply reading a text does not provide. What you have to do is you have to engage with the larger ramification of the text, and in this sense, the context. And that's where the discourse analysis has come, that one has been talking about it for a long time now, almost more than 3 decades since Foucault and earlier, that how discursive exercise or discursive lens is also very, very important to make sense of more, sort of institutional understanding of an object like a state. So, what I would like to say that even though the discipline has reinvented itself in many ways, and it has moved away from simple criteria of predictability or power of explanation or the power of facticity or burden of causal explanation, verifiability, falsification that earlier it was sort of endowed with, that political science as a discipline must actually rest itself on these principles or on these criteria. But we have come a long way where we do take into account the self-reflexivity. Self-reflexivity being that the discipline has its own reflexivity about itself, as well as the researcher also wears the lens of self-reflexivity, which is to say, as I was saying earlier, the positionality of power within which the researcher is embedded, within which the discipline has grown. So, reading a book, for example, by anybody for that matter, if you read John Scott's work on Malaysia, Weapons of the Weak, you may agree with his theoretical framework, yet at the same time, you are outside the Malaysian framework that he is deeply engaged with. So, what kind of critical lens do you wear to understand what his Weapons of the Weak is doing in this, what he's doing in this book, by even the name of the book, Weapons of the Weak? So, ethical concerns of the researcher, as I said, are very, very important. And another old-fashioned term, versetine, that William Dilthey gave, which is to translate as understanding, is also come in a variety of ways. No longer we talk about understanding as a normative concept, as we talked about earlier, because we are talking about the messy world of the politics. We are not talking about arts and aesthetics here. The world of politics is extremely messy. It defies all norms and facts which otherwise can be deciphered at times, unproblematically. And therefore, the discipline has to wear this extra thick lens of interpretation, or what Girge would call, in an anthropological word, using the framework of thick description. So it's in that sense that the idea of the state is state power, political institutions, political procedures, to name a few. Of course, one can go on, talking about different ways in which the power manifests itself. But if one is focusing only on the idea of the state institutions, idea of the nation and nationalism, or the idea of sovereignty and so forth, one is also talking about the contrary position of it. That is to say, the deinstitutionalization of the institutions, right? And that's where you wonder at times, why is it that democracies, which has prospered, which has been around for so long, is now slithering? Why is it that we are seeing the rise of authoritarianism? Do we have sufficient explanation for that? Or is it simply, an ad hoc explanation that we have in front of us? So the older concepts and categories that dominated the field for long, long time have been interrogated and reinterpreted. Suzanne Rudolph, again from the Department of Political Science of University of Chicago, used an iconic phrase called imperialism of categories, that how categories themselves become hegemonic. And in this, she had the idea of Western hegemonic categories, right, which are used by area studies specialists or scholars who go and study the non-Western world. So the question is, how does one go beyond the binaries of various kinds, right? Quantitative, qualitative methods that has dominated the field for a long time, still continues to dominate. And newer methodological frameworks, which are more interpretative, which are more ethnographical, which are more discursive, which were more culturally nuanced, have come to stay with us to make the discipline much more alive, I would say, or much more interesting.
Great. Thank you. And I think this is a great segue to the next section. Next piece that I wanted to discuss with you is about um, your engagement with the University of Chicago, your field of study, and how things have shaped, how those things have shaped your academic pursuit. So you did your PhD from the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago, and we all know that the school has it's known for its various schools of thought, particularly the free market economy set off by Milton Friedman's writings in the Department of Economics, or the work around modernization and urbanization theories associated with Edward Shills and others in the Department of Sociology. What have been the major strands of thinking shaping the discipline of political science at the University of Chicago over the last few decades? And if you can tell us a little bit, share your understanding on the history of the discipline and its growth over the years. And if you can tell us how newer methodological and conceptual issues the faculty members have engaged with over the years to establish the new research grounds in the discipline.
That's a very um, big question. I mean, given the time and paucity of we have, I might not be able to do justice to it. But yes, I mean, the Department of Political Science was founded around the same time when the university was founded, I think in 1892 or 93. So it's fairly a very old department. And the department was known to begin with its work on behaviorism, in work on modernization theories. It was seen as, like many other departments that were set up after the Second World War, but even before that, it was also seen as a department which excelled itself in the studies on Cold War, in international relations, in comparative politics, and so on and so forth. So you have people like Hans Morgenthau and Leo Key, and many luminaries who actually dominated the field of international relations at the department for a long time. But as the years passed by and the modernization framework began to be challenged, I think the department also moved by adopting newer methodological frameworks. It is a big department, and it sort of people like Lloyd and Suzanne Rudolph, who worked all their life on India, on South Asia as part of their understanding in the department was, about working on the working on India actually, but not on other parts of South Asia. But you also had people like Susan Stock, Gary Harrigal. When I was a student, and I'm not talking about pre 1990s or post 1990s, but this was the time which actually was a time when great debates were happening in the discipline of political science. You had rational choice that Jon Elster brought into the department, David Layton, who talked about language games. And of course, the rational choice approach was not so very well welcomed, but there were people who were, moving beyond it and bringing in more sort of newer approaches like interpretative methods, new historicism, and questions of new literary criticism into the field of political science, because the way in which interdisciplinarity works at Chicago or any other major university in the US is that you also have students who take courses from other departments, or when they do their research, they have the option of taking on board people from other departments. For example, when I was doing my PhD, I had A.K. Ramanujan, but unfortunately he passed away suddenly. But I had people from sociology, from history, William Soon, Mosh Postone, apart from the political scientists. Arjuna Padurai is very well known figure in the anthropology department. So the students were encouraged always to go beyond the narrow confines of their discipline. And it is also interesting to see how area studies program evolved in American universities out of the PL 480 grant. And Chicago was the leading university in this. And therefore, it was not just the Department of Political Science where you had country specific work being done, but you also had University of Michigan, you had Stanford, where Rajni Kothari, the leading political scientists of India in the 60s, did his work. He also went to Michigan to do the election survey work. So I think there was an entire sort of habitus of the discipline that was evolving and growing around these issues. And not to forget that the South Asia Studies Department, the Committee on Southern Asian Studies, as well as the Department of South Asian Culture and Civilization at the University of Chicago was the most prominent one. And you had people, who were best in their field. You had Shelley Pollock, you had A.K. Ramanujan, you had Norman Cutler, you had Jafar Alam, you have now Dipesh Chakravarti there. You had people who had primary appointment in major disciplines like anthropology or history or political science, but also had sort of appointments in COSAS or Department of South Asian Culture and Civilization. And it was just a corridor connecting from my department, Pick Hall, to the COSAS that one leisurely walked up to and one went and saw what was happening. But more than that, a number of workshops used to take place on different subfields of the discipline. And these workshops were the meeting places of faculty and graduate students. The idea was that beyond the classroom discussion and teaching, there must be venues where students can sit and have a brainstorming session. So students will present their work in progress, particularly their chapters of theses in American politics workshop. I was part of, for many years, I was part of what was then called SAME, South Asian Middle East workshop. You had comparative workshop, you had Latin American workshop, you had interdisciplinary social theory workshop. So, in some ways, the discipline was already breaking itself out of these, as I said, very traditional and narrow confines of its boundary. Another important, I think, part of learning the discipline at the University of Chicago was the connection with anthropology and sociology. You had people like Mackie Marriott, Bernard Cohn, a legendary teacher and a scholar whose writings actually influenced a large number of younger scholars. You have Jean and John Kamaroff working on Africa. So a large number of anthropologists and sociologists down the line were also, coming and speaking to students in different forums. In the process, what emerged was a much larger field of study, as if you're always in some kind of a hybrid mode. You're always trying to catch up to learn new things. And I'm thinking of the social theory courses as well as the workshop, where we learned a great deal about the, sort of Frankfurt School from Mosh Postone, who was one of my supervisors. And so in some ways, it was seen as if simple understanding of text or textual interpretation will not do justice to your discipline. Therefore, you must move out and learn the new approaches and bring them into your own work. And I forgot to mention, Homi Bhabha was there. And with Homi Bhabha's arrival came this whole idea of cultural studies and new literary criticism. We had a very strong English literature department, South Asian Studies department, as I already mentioned, but you also had Near Asian Studies department, Chinese and Japanese, and so on and so forth. Here, Haratunian, a very well-known Japanese scholar. So, in all of this, as a young scholar, you did feel intimidated by all these luminaries who were like great in their field, but their works in a way challenged their own field to a great extent. And I think that was refreshing for somebody doing research, whether in political science or history, and so on and so forth. So what happened in the process was the idea of sub fields emerging for your own work. You would create a kind of newer field of or new approach to your own work. So, for example, in my work, I began to think about the idea of semiotics, the idea of political anthropology, idea of linguistic anthropology, and Michael Silverstein was one of the great iconic scholars at that time in Chicago. So every student, as if came under this some kind of a intellectual, requirement to have particular kind of a methodological framework, which was not completely breaking away from the discipline or interdisciplinarity of a certain kind, but also trying to bring in something new, something novel, based on the research, based on the writings, based on the very intense method of evaluation, whether through exams or assignment papers. So, in a way, a lot which had remained unexplored for me in India was explored when I went there. And this whole binary between subject and object that Bourdieu talks about, the idea of the doxa, the idea of the habitus in the field, also became much more clear. Um, so I think what Chicago taught me, that as a comparativist, if you're doing large scale comparisons, which I didn't do, but a lot of political scientists do, and surveys and large scale surveys, whether related to elections or any other subject of their inquiry, but they must also be careful what kind of comparative method they adopt or what kind of comparativism they do. Is there a certain kind of relationality that must be taken into account and not just do random sampling or snowball sampling, simply a random survey? So it comes to my mind the whole idea of chalk and cheese, or Peter Mayer used this word that you could do two kind of comparisons. One he called chalk and cheese, and one he called apple and pear. So you should be mindful of what kind of comparison you are doing. If you are working on Germany, France, Britain, and US, which was, very fashionable at that time with Thorndike Scotch Pole and others works emerging, Barrington Moore, you must have your lens of inquiry worked out quite well in advance.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Asha. Well, now coming to the current times, when AI, digital humanities, data science, formal modeling, and all are at play, how do you see the discipline of political science changing itself? What will be the challenges? What are the new technologies and the tools of research that can be innovatively used to understand the changing contours of power contestations among nation states of our times? Many of us over here are researchers and interested in the discipline. There are many young researchers. I'm sure they're planning their further course of research and would like to know this part from you. Definitely, Asha.
Something that I have yet not explored myself, the word of AI and so on and so forth. But one can see the sort of consequences emerging out of it at multiple levels. I can see as a teacher, as a scholar in India, that AI may provide certain tools to increase my efficiency, of a certain kind. But let's also not forget that it will provide a certain kind of instant gratification, if I can use that word, or certain kind of a, overburdening of a statistical information. We are already under the age of information that we talked about 30 years ago, but now we are talking about post-information, post-human, post-truth times. So AI, to what extent, I mean, it's called artificial intelligence, but it's also being called alternative intelligence. To what extent it can actually replace the human interpretative uh, skills or methods in social sciences? Because whatever it may be, the social sciences is about the human beings, about the individuals, about real people. The machine learning, for example, these LLMs, the large language models that are being now used in the American academia, my friends tell me, but they cannot really replace, in my understanding or limited knowledge of it, the human. To use the word again, Dilthayan word, understanding, or the thick interpretation that I would like to have, even about a very small segment of the reality that I'm interested to study. And it's the relations of power, that might need to be tended to much more carefully in the time of AI. You may have models emerging, you may have instant sort of results for any kind of sort of problem you have inserted, but you may not be able to decipher what Foucault would call the micro sort of biopolitics of power. So it is in that regard that I am little wary about the invasion of AI on social science. For example, for long, sociologists and political scientists and anthropologists studied caste, right? Caste in India, let's say, or race in America or in Western world. Now, can you ever really understand all the uh, vicissitudes, all the deep structures of hierarchies or deep structures of humiliation that the caste as a system has through any use of AI? I can very boldly say no. So, in fact, so you can say that facts are important. So maybe AI can give us facts, data science can give us facts, mechanized learning can give us facts, but those facts also need to be countered. There is something called counterfactual, which is very important in the social sciences. Where do you get that in your this new technology? And the technology itself will be enslaving, where it will start imposing the great burden of understanding on us. Will we veer away from the actual learning, which means spending time in the field, also having a certain degree of interlocution, certain degree of empathy, certain language that we must know in order to make a conversation. I'm not talking about language as language, but it cannot be simply an instrumental communicative device. It's also part of meaning making system. It's also part of symbolic mediation and signification process. Sometimes the silence can say more than the words. So I think the entire vocabulary, the entire sort of understanding of the disciplines will undergo tremendous change if we allow AI indiscriminately to some extent. Let me just give you one example to make it clear. We are talking about census for a long time now. The census, which was supposed to happen in 21 and could not take place because of the pandemic. Now, the census of 2021 as an enumerative exercise will be very different from the census of 1921, let's say. The enumerative logic has changed. The mandate given to the census now has to be different because it is part of the democratization process than the census that the colonial state started for reasons. of colonial power to be exercised to command and control over the colonized people, right? So, but we cannot say that census over the last 150 years, because the first census started in 1872, has happened uninterruptedly without any qualms. So, I think or the whole idea of census being important now for delimitation exercise, which we didn't think before independence. So, I think any particular subject of inquiry in social science in general, or let's say in this field of political science, has to be taken very cautiously. There are moral, ethical issues too. Will we be able to hold the machines accountable for any kind of results that may have implication for the people at large? We have seen it through the elections over years, not just in India, but all around the world. So I think the use of AI, in my understanding, will also take away the pleasure of doing research, which is very personal and also which in some way throws up issues of representation, issues of power, issues of legitimacy, issues of ethical neutrality, or what Charles Taylor called social theory has to be in conjunction with the practice of human beings. Social theory and social practice, they are not separate. One actually informs the other. So it's important, therefore, that we take into account all these different dimensions of research before we allow to be swamped by AI or data science and so on and so forth.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Asha. Well, my last question to you before we open it up for discussion is about this issue of intersectionalities. So can we say that the intersectionalities over concepts and categories that have enriched the interdisciplinary nature of the discipline? In what ways can interdisciplinarity rescue the discipline from its old normative burdens? Can you please share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so when you say intersectionality, you mean to say that there are certain ways in which the discipline has looked at the newer forms of establishing relationalities of certain kind. For example, if one is talking about the Dalit politics or the feminist literature or the Dalit literature, it will not be appropriate to talk about Dalit literature or Dalit politics without taking into account the relations of not just caste, of class, of gender, of region, and so on and so forth. So intersectionalities, both in the feminist literature and the Dalit literature, have shown us that the hermeneutic lens has to be widened, has to be broadened. You cannot just limit yourself to one particular section of the subject that you are studying. You have to, and that brings to my mind the issue of arbitrariness of power. For long we thought, I mean, with Harold Aswell, David Dell, and many other, political scientists who dominated the field, that the concept of power is who gets what, where, and when. But now we have moved away from that definitional scope of power. We are also looking at how power is arbitrary. And this arbitrariness of power is both a micro and macro phenomena. You may find presence of it, absence of it. You may find it organized and not so organized. And people have been forced to accept certain arbitrariness of power. So, to go back to from where you started, Leni, the idea of the state and its power and institutions, and that's where we can also once again bring the idea of intersectionality and how that will, in some way, question the normative burden of the field, which is to say, the large number of the large number of writings or works or scholarship in the field of political philosophy, thought, and theory has given us a huge normative and conceptual vocabulary. But it has also left the field wide open at times when we want to make sense of those sort of normative concepts empirically. So the quest, so in pluralistic societies like India, or for that matter, in many other parts of the world, you have to look at the multiple sources of power. You have to look at the idea of identity and difference. You have to look at the idea of diversities of various kinds. It won't be fair to say that we only look at one segment of a reality, however narrow you may define it, without actually looking at the other side of the coin. So, in that respect, the older categories and concepts, I would say, have been interrogated sufficiently to pave the way for newer methods and newer approaches, going beyond the simple liberal Marxist structural functionalist, again, the school that was dominant in the Department of University of Chicago, uh, to give us what seems to be critical, very, very critical approaches which are also sophisticated, discursive, and communicationally plural. So I think if one looks at the way in which the global capitalism has unfolded, the financial crisis that one associates with the global capitalism, the invasion of the free market, or you can say the invasion of the global market, we can see its sort of outcome in our own times right now. All of this has to do with the idea of what Philip Sayre called stateness. To what extent the fault lines between the political and the social basis of power have to be made sense of. We cannot divorce the study of politics from the larger social canvas on which the idea of the power rests itself, affecting the lives of individuals and communities and nation states. So, though we do talk about a neoliberal or a post-liberal market economy that the time we are living in, which also has a far more repressive world order and going beyond Wallersteinian understanding of world system. But it has also shown that the state has tremendous outreach in terms of exercising its power, not just domestically, locally, but also internationally. And the same sites where the coercion happens also become the sites of resistance. And one has to be therefore mindful about the conceptual languages. So, conceptual language that one uses to make sense of these intersectionalities or the normative lineages of the discipline, to also see to what extent this conceptual language is also the political language, is also the language of freedom and equality and justice, and enables us to talk about the deep-seated oppressions and exploitations in any society. And how is that possible? I was thinking, I'm reminded of Rogers Brubaker's iconic phrase that he used in his study on ethnicity and nationalism, that there is something called relational comparability or commensurability project, that across the divide within the society, within the states, within the nations, across that, you will be able to build upon this larger sort of solidarities of certain kind, because the internal structures of inequalities work in the same manner to some extent. And therefore, the inner working, understanding the inner working of state power, the inner structures of state power, both historically and contemporarily, is very important for us.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Asha. Well, we have a lot of questions which have come from our participants. I will see if we can how we can do justice to all of them, because we don't have much time, but still we'll pick up a few questions and ask you. So the first question is, I'll just read it out. as someone interested in documenting political events from the ground, how can we use interdisciplinary methods without formal academic training? What should we be careful about when combining observation with analysis? Would you like to take that question, Asha, or should I?
Yeah. No, I think it's a great question. I think the question really touches the heart of the subject that we are talking about. How does one take care of some kind of a gap that might emerge between observation and the final analysis? And as I said earlier, that it's not observation on a tabula rasa. It's not an observation without a certain kind of preordained understanding of the field that Charles Taylor talks about, or many other scholars have talked about. So when you say that you are going with the lens of observation to do a research, what is it that you are going for? What kind of observation? Why do you want to observe certain phenomena and not the other phenomena? So I think the choice, it starts from the choice itself. And I think that has to be complicated and interrogated too. Why is it that I'm interested in doing a particular kind of work? And I think works of Bourdieu and many others from critical social theory has sufficiently informed us that the subject position of the researcher itself is the political act. And therefore, the analysis is also not beyond these questions. So, observation in itself is a technique, yes, but what field of observation you have, where you do the observation, what kind of observation. It cannot simply be that you and I can do the same kind of observation. We are phenomenologically also, we are socially and culturally determined, and we also have phenomenological lens to begin with. So I think that's where we need to be mindful as to our observation has to be ethically and morally justifiable, accountable. We have to hold ourselves responsible for what our observation leads to.
Great. Thank you so much, Asha. The next question is from Tista. Well, unfortunately, since all the names are not reflecting, I'm not able to acknowledge the people who've asked this question. For those whose names I can see, I'm just mentioning those. The question is from Tista. She says, your remarks are thought-provoking in terms of making us think about interdisciplinarity in relation to other humanities disciplines as well, in which the constraints may be rather distinct in certain ways. I'm especially interested in your take on languages as identifying entities in the polity. Given your significant work on the topic, could you say a bit more on this matter?
Thank you, Tista. I didn't notice that Tista was there. Thank you for asking. You being a linguist, and we were together at the same time at the University of Chicago, I think I have much to learn from your discipline and from you. But I think linguistics is the master science, much before any other discipline that we talk about. I consider linguistics as the mother of all other sciences or disciplines. And in my own work on the question of language, power, state, reorganization of states or language and politics, broadly speaking, and the entire nationalist discourse on language question that has emerged in India since the mid-19th century, has to do a lot with how we think about language, not simply as a communicative tool, not simply as an instrument of communicative rationality, but also as something more, as you would know it more than me, Tista, in terms of societal understanding of it, in terms of meaning-making system, in terms of signification, in terms of symbolic understanding of it. But it's not simply symbolic, I would say it is also very much material, where it affects the life and death of people, particularly when the state tries to make policies of a certain kind, then it gets intertwined with the whole political economy question. Look at the way in which three language formula debate has been taking place in this country. I mean, earlier Tamil Nadu and then later Maharashtra. So I think so it's rather late in the day that still political scientists, very few political scientists have actually taken language as a critical category of explanation of a kind which can actually throw up very interesting idea of power and its manifestation. I always tell my students that whoever is doing research in whichever area, you must take the category of language, not because I'm interested, but I think you need to take that on board. Otherwise, we all end up using language in a very mechanical, instrumentalist way, and that's where actually I have a fear of AI, which might rob us of all the innovativeness, of all the beautiful, aesthetic, subtle way in which the language enables us as human beings. As Charles Taylor said, one of the things that distinguishes human beings from animal world is the language, because that's the mode through which you identify yourself. So the whole question of an identity and difference has to be seen through through this category in his understanding. But yes, I mean, you're right, is that we need to do much more with it. People like Lisa Michelle, Sumati Ramaswamy, and many others have taken particular languages and looked at the way in which the idea of community identity, nation formation, or the way in which pedagogical uses of language have enabled us to look at the way in which identities are constructed or mobilized. Paul Brass's early work on language, religion, and nation was about three states, where he looked at the way in which language actually mobilized the community identity in a very serious way. So I think yes, we need to do much more in this than we have done till now. Thank you, Tista.
And maybe Tista and Asha, we should have a conversation between both of you so that,
In fact, I was thinking this morning that I would have liked to have Tista
so we'll have
this.
We should plan a conversation between the two of you so that we can delve deeper into the issues that you're mentioning. Well, I'll go on to the next question. It is about how can a researcher effectively collect data on controversial or sensitive topics, particularly when the subjects are hesitant to speak due to concerns about public reputation or prestige, and also when these topics are also institutionally protected or guarded. Well, this is a sensitive question.
As the question is difficult, so is the answer. I think the whole idea of interviews that earlier dominated or questionnaire that our students still do when they go to the field, they make questions. And I ask them, show me your questions before you even go to the field. Some of the questions then need to be dropped because either they are too value laden, or they are too sort of they do not pass on the ethical neutrality issue. When it comes to sensitive issues, depends what is considered sensitive and depends where your site of research is. One has to use certain subversive methods in doing the research. People may not come forward to tell you, but then you have to invent your own modus operandi. You have to listen to the whispering sounds, or you have to eavesdrop. But more than that, I think if one goes back to the archives, let's say, if one is doing a historical work, some of the archives which were not available to us because they were classified documents, which are now declassified, and new scholarship is emerging, particularly the work on post-Cold War period. And we can make sense of the political archives there. But I think the question is about the presentism, doing research in our own time and giving the censorship, giving the surveillance, giving the state control, or giving the deep institutional sort of control over research these days um, does prevent us from being bold sometimes. But I think if one stays longer in the field and is willing to take certain hardship and spend great deal of time, maybe some of the questions that you have in mind might give you certain answers. But yes, the times are different and difficult, and therefore we need to do more provocative kind of research. We need to go beyond the narrow lenses of it and devise our own different methodological framework which can actually escape the eye of the power, be it.
Thank you. Thank you, Asha. There's another question, which is on as you talk about the position and privilege in doing field studies, one general understanding of privileged is a researcher coming from upper strata or race to study the community or individual who are in the lower strata. Here it makes, here it is a make the sense of understanding the notion of privilege as an outsider, but sometime as an outsider, we face some challenges like language, everyday cultural communication with the participants, etc. Secondly, the reverse one, for instance, if a researcher is not an outsider, but from the same community, place or area, definitely will have a smooth way of approaching the field of the people. Meaning that how do we define the term privilege in doing ethnographic studies? I hope were you able to get the question, Asha?
Yes. So I think the ethnographer's gaze is something which has been much debated, or ethnographer's magic has been much talked about in the discipline of anthropology for the last few years. But I think the question is valid on both counts as an outsider versus insider. As an outsider, how do you analyze, how do you evaluate, how do you study vis-a-vis the insider? I would say that as an insider, you may have the felicity of language, of cultural understanding, of a certain kind of compatibility, collegiality, but you may also not be ready, or you may not be familiar with the density and the depth of the subject that you are studying or the field that you're investigating. Being an insider also poses its own challenges. You are seen as someone either different or similar, or having a certain kind of a position of privilege, just as in the case of an outsider. So I think what one needs to do is, to be self-reflexive, as self-reflexivity as a principle has been talked much about, and people have talked about self as other in anthropology. There's this. So, in other words, is language the only barrier? Yes, to some extent, it becomes a huge barrier, and therefore, I think in the area studies program, one of the most important things that before researchers were sent out to work in the field was to learn the language of the people or the place that they were studying, and it still continues to be the case, particularly with anthropologists and also political scientists. So language will enable you to partake in the everydayness of the life, in terms of the rituals and cultural practices, and also will, in a way, create a certain degree of empathy on behalf of the people that you are studying. Um, but the question of privilege, position will continue to haunt. I think if we are talking about the hierarchical positioning in the research, in the field, I don't think we can ever escape from that. So certain kind of stereotypes, certain kinds of taboo and stigma will have to be very carefully navigated through and be mindful of. Um, and all that will come if one spends a great deal of time in the field and becomes sensitive and develops a certain kind of empathy. I think that might be one way of sort of challenging this idea of a privileged position on both sides, as an insider as well as outsider.
Great, thank you. Well, the last question, there are a couple of more questions, but I don't think we have the time to take those. I'll take the last one, which is, can you please suggest some or any particular book which touches on methodological understanding of political science discipline or its associates? I feel sometimes I try to position myself as a political scientist, but could not in the era of hybridization or methodology. In addition, can you please talk on a bit what kind of inquiries can be said to be political or not political, which is sociological, history, economics? Is political science somewhere limited to state and power? Well, this is a question which requires a full session, but Asha, to you.
Okay, so I think the first question about a book on methods. I mean, there are many books available in the market, but I think um, if I were to start thinking about it in a more critical manner and not simply look at methods as devices, as mechanisms to do my research or as some kind of tools, I would maybe start with a small book, very small, which is actually a lecture published called Social Theory as Practice by Charles Taylor, which in a way complicates the whole idea of normative understanding of the field and the idea of predetermined um, subject position and how the social theory itself is a practice. So any kind of theoretical formulation that you may have in your mind before you go to the field must be also critically engaged with. Are we theoretically born, or do we acquire theoretical understanding as we grow? So I think this tension between theory and practice has remained and has affected all fields of social sciences, not just political science. So social theory, Frankfurt School was one which in a way gave us, uh, you know, a deep understanding onto it. Writings of Foucault, Order of Things, or many others, Gramsci's own writings, I would even say Bakhtin's writings. These are writings which actually take you beyond the political science optic. Uh, they in some ways will familiarize you how not just the state power functions, but how the questions of resistance, questions of hegemony, questions of habitus in Bourdieu, a question of discourse and discursive power operators, or to so just to say it more simplistically, political science is not only about power and state power, but power is, as Foucault will say, omnipresent. It's everywhere. Now it's up to us how we make sense of it. But at the same time, you cannot escape from the tentacles of power. I'm not suggesting that there are no other ways of doing political science. In fact, if you read a literary text, for example, and now the discipline has also started making use of literary criticism taking clue from cultural comparativism or cultural studies in a big way, from post-colonial literature in a big way. You will be surprised to see when you read a literature, it is not simply a piece of art, but it also has narratives. It also has subtext, and a very subtle subtext, which actually speaks about the power of the day, or you can say about the power of the feudal lord in a village, or the power of the school teacher in a school, and so on and so forth. So, in that sense, the everydayness of it, however arbitrary it may look, has to be captured. And that's where I think I sort of put the idea of power. It's not simply residing in large institutions, or simply in political parties, or in election commission, or in legislative bodies, or in judiciary, but it's also how it sort of, in a Foucauldian sense, a capillary form of it. It actually stays in sometimes invisible ways, but very much part of our everydayness of it, and it manifests, and it appears and reappears in ways that sometimes we may not be able to make sense of. So that sociologists also worry about, anthropologists also talk about it, economists are talking about it, power of the market, and even the cultural historians are talking about it. Historians have also talked about it. So I think it was in that sort of macro sense I was using the term power.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Asha. Well, I must say, this was a master class, Asha. I don't think,
Come on.
no, of course, we couldn't have packed in so much, such rich academic discussion with so many examples, right from theory, concept to practical issues, and contextualizing it across issues, across disciplines, across geographies. I don't think we could have done a better job than this. So thank you very much for enabling all of us to listen to you.
So I think just the person who asked about the book on methods, if I could, I mean, I did talk about Taylor, but one, he or she, whoever it is, can go back to Weber's essay, which was published more than 100 years ago, but which is still is considered a classical piece, called Methodology of Social Sciences, where he talks about the concerns of normative judgment versus empirical knowledge. So I think this whole question of privilege, position, how do we do the observation, how do we feel, how do we be an insider and outsider, all these concerns are addressed to some extent, of course, in a very limited way, because it was written 100 years ago in a German context. But I think this is one essay one can still read.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Asha. Well, a big
My pleasure.
a big thank you to all the participants who joined and who asked questions. Please do stay in touch with the Delhi Center. The Delhi Center organizes many such interesting, academically rich sessions. Jubakshi has already mentioned about the series that we are doing, the virtual series on research methods. We will have speakers from various disciplines who will be talking about their work and also about interdisciplinarity as in their disciplines also. So do stay in touch. We'll be very happy to send you all the information. And yeah, looking forward to many more interesting discussions like this. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Leni, for taking this initiative, and thank you, Jubakshi, for keeping me constantly informed, and so many emails back and forth. But Leni, I think you deserve a huge applause from me, because I think you started something which we all worry about all the time. So thank you for taking lead on it.
Thank you so much for being there. Thank you.
Thank you, and good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.